What's up guys, Dr. Shepard here. Today we are talking about existential OCD. As with all of these videos on different OCD subtypes, we are going to be talking in detail about the types of obsessions and compulsions that people with these types of OCD might have. And I think it's important that we describe this stuff in detail so that people can really understand, identify with their symptoms, and realize that they're not alone. But at the same time, describing them in such detail can be really triggering for people. So please note that this is the kind of stuff we're going to be talking about. Make sure you're in an okay headspace for this, and if not, it's always okay to turn it off, come back to it later, or not at all. Okay, so first off, what is existential OCD? Well, existential OCD basically refers to a philosophical type of OCD, or a type of OCD where someone questions their reality, the meaning of life, all of that stuff. We all do this to some extent. We all have thoughts about the future, about our lives, about our purpose, about reality, the meaning of life, death, life after death, all of that stuff. But the difference is that we don't tend to get really swept up in those thoughts, and they don't cause a ton of anxiety. Whereas for someone with existential OCD, this might be all that they can think about. These thoughts might be really upsetting, really disruptive, and might really get in the way of their ability to live their normal life. So all in all, the obsessions that we see in someone with existential OCD are going to be these major, big life questions. Things that the ancient philosophers used to study, questions that there are no answers to, and things that we generally kind of sweep under the rug going about our day-to-day lives, because if we sit there and think about it too much, it becomes overwhelming. But for someone with existential OCD, they really can't get this off their mind. And the very fact that these are questions that really can't be answered make them a perfect target for OCD. OCD loves to go after anything that's uncertain. Uncertainty is something that makes people with OCD extremely uncomfortable and is often the nexus for their obsessions and compulsions. So someone with existential OCD might have thoughts like, what is the universe? Is the universe even real? Am I even real? Is this me being in a coma right now? Are my kids real? Is my husband real? What if all of this is just a simulation? What is the meaning of life? What's the purpose of life? Or sort of the more negative versions of those questions, like there is no purpose, there is no meaning of life, I'm just going to die, nothing's going to happen after death. Phew. A lot of it can center around that sort of meaninglessness of life and fears about life after death, fears about unreality, reality, different from depersonalization and derealization, where it's not a concern about uncertainty, but rather it's feeling like things aren't real. Check out the previous videos on DPDR if you want to know more about the difference. Sometimes the obsessions in existential OCD can just be these feelings of like being really tiny and knowing that the odds that you're actually here and on this planet are incredibly small. And so it's not so much a specific like string of words as a thought, but rather this feeling of like looking up into the night sky and being like, oh my gosh, how am I even a part of this humongous universe? So obviously these are questions that again are normal for the average person to have, but these are big questions. They can be upsetting. And in OCD, your brain kind of grabs onto this stuff and says, you know what, we have to figure out an answer. But of course we can't, we're left with that uncertainty, and that's so uncomfortable for someone with OCD. So how do people with existential OCD typically deal with the obsessions that they have? Compulsions that are really common in this form of OCD are things like researching the meaning of life, researching existence and how we came into existence, researching various philosophical theories or religious texts and trying to figure out the answer to the meaning of life. Some people do a lot of checking and testing. So this is especially common if someone develops a fear that they are not real or that they are in a coma or in a simulation. So basically going and asking a friend or family member, hey, I remember that this, and this happened earlier. Is that accurate? Is that something that you saw too? Trying to get reassurance that what you saw actually happened. People with OCD can also sometimes do compulsions that really don't seem to make a lot of sense. And oftentimes they know logically that it doesn't make a lot of sense. So they may do something like counting to a certain number or looking out for certain numbers, words, patterns, things to happen to sort of reaffirm to them that they are either real or not real, looking out for like messages from people on social media, for example, or looking out for messages in the news, strange things happening that might tell them whether or not they are real. People with this form of OCD also engage in a lot of rationalizing with themselves, reassuring themselves, trying to figure out, okay, am I achieving my purpose? Is there a purpose? What is the deal with this? They might mull it over and over and over again in their head. And again, this is different from the normal questioning of what's my purpose in life, because it is excessive and it gets in the way of their ability to do what they want to do. It causes them distress. It makes them very anxious. Also common in this form of OCD is just plain old avoiding. So people with existential OCD might try very hard to avoid any exposure to anything that might dredge up those feelings of fear or doubt or uncertainty about reality, the meaning of life, life after death, all of that stuff. So often this takes the form of avoiding certain movies and books. People will often avoid watching the news or looking at certain things on social media because they can be very triggering. Interestingly, mindfulness and meditation and that sort of thing are something that we often recommend for different anxiety disorders, for obsessive compulsive disorder in general. And this is something that can actually be really triggering for someone with existential OCD if it's not done properly. So they might end up avoiding just spending too much time alone with themselves in their thoughts, focusing on their thoughts, thinking about themselves. So how do we treat existential OCD? Well, we treat it very much like we treat other forms of OCD. Again, we want to help the person break the cycle of engaging in compulsions, which then strengthen those obsessions. So like I just mentioned, part of the compulsions that we engage in when we have existential OCD are things like avoiding thinking about the topic. Instead, when someone is struggling with this form of OCD, we actually want them to think more about the topic. Hear me out on this. So this is something called exposure and response prevention. It's something that really is best done with the aid of a trained, skilled therapist in this subject. But basically what we do is we help the person by exposing them to the thing that they're afraid of. So in this case, thoughts about things not being real or thoughts about the meaning of life. And eventually what happens is you repeat the same things over and over again. You think about the same things over and over again, you focus on them, and eventually your mind gets bored and moves on. We've talked about this before, but basically resisting or avoiding these kinds of thoughts is the best way to ensure that they stick around, because you're telling your brain, hey, if I'm trying to push this out of my mind, if I'm really focused on getting rid of this, it must be important. And I have to make sure I'm scouring my brain for any time this thought might pop up. So of course, you're gonna notice it even more. What we try to do is get you comfortable with having the thoughts. Thoughts are okay. There's no such thing as a dangerous thought. It's something inside us where we decide whether or not to give the thought its meaning. Just like our hearts beat, our lungs breathe, our brains think. That's their job. So of course these existential questions are gonna come up at some point. And with someone with existential OCD, they're gonna come up a lot more because you've trained yourself to really look for them. So what we wanna do is allow those thoughts to come up when they wanna come up. And when you notice them, you just label them. Existential thinking, or there's thinking, or I'm judging, or I'm feeling anxious. You're noticing them, you're labeling them, and it seems really simple and kind of silly, to be honest, but what it does is it gives you some distance from those thoughts so that they seem a little bit less scary and you don't necessarily have to act on them right away. Then the more you experience those thoughts, the more you feel them, the less excited your brain is going to be when it thinks about them, and you're going to eventually lose interest. And losing interest may not mean that you never think another thought about your existential worries again, but it might mean that you can take a step back and not get as sucked into those worries. So oftentimes in exposure and response prevention types of therapy, we will expose the person intentionally to these thoughts. So for example, maybe having them write the same thought down over and over again, or have them sing the thought aloud in a silly voice, or have them write down the thought and look at it over and over again until it just doesn't even register anymore. Another thing that we do for therapy for people with this type of OCD therapy is we help them identify what we call cognitive distortions in their thinking. So thought patterns that come up that center around these existential concerns that maybe aren't helpful or aren't accurate. So one example of this would be emotional reasoning. Say you are feeling anxious because you've had a stressful day at work, and then all of a sudden the thought pops into your mind, what if nothing happens after we die? Because you're already feeling anxious, you might assign more meaning to that thought or feel like it needs to be addressed right away, or that it's more important than you would if you weren't feeling anxious at that moment. Another really good example is selective abstraction or tunnel vision. So the idea here is that you notice something that sort of reinforces the fear or the obsessive thoughts, and you zero in on that and become very concerned about it. So for example, if you had a fear that you were in a coma and that this was all just a dream, you might go back and check in with a friend and say, this is what I remember about when we spent time together this morning. Is this the same as what you remember? And maybe there's a discrepancy in what they remember when compared to what you remember. For someone with existential OCD, they might selectively tunnel in on that discrepancy and say, oh, even though everything else is the same and they are assuring me that I was really there and this was all real, there was that one little discrepancy. So maybe that means that things weren't real. Again, best way to address this stuff is by working with a therapist who has experience in treating OCD. There are a couple of excellent workbooks and resources that I will link in the description box. I also have a bunch of blog posts that I've written on the subject if you want more information. But if you find this video helpful, please consider hitting like, hitting subscribe. I also have a lot of other goodies and extras on Patreon, and if you really struggle with anxiety and want to see a bunch of tips and worksheets and extras all in one place, check out the Anxiety Bootcamp course that I made with all of the information that I use to help myself and my patients when they're struggling with anxiety. Thanks again for watching. Let me know what you'd like to talk about in future videos down below, and I will see you guys later.